What's going on, guys? Ben Brewster here at triathletics.com. Today we're going to be talking about a common misconception with regards to the arm spiral or the pitching arm action and how that works. We're going to talk about the second arm spiral, or what you can refer to as the second phase of the arm spiral, and exactly what should be happening. So we're going to try to understand exactly what's going on physiologically, biomechanically, and then a couple drills and tips that you guys can implement, as well as cues and how we coach it. So what is the second arm spiral, or the second part of the arm spiral? This first requires understanding what the arm spiral is. For those of you not familiar, the arm spiral is essentially a cue or an analogy for describing the spiral or helical path that the arm action typically takes in most of the hardest throwers, where it looks like it's winding up kind of this staircase-like pattern, and it's creating these connected loops of energy that efficiently transfer this momentum through the arm, ultimately out into the ball. So the first part of the arm spiral, we're going to break that complex path that the arm is going through, that complex spiraling action, into two parts. The first part would be from handbrake to the high cock position, or to flip up. It'd be from here to there. That's an easy way to understand the first part of the arm spiral, is how do we get from point A to point B. Now then the second part would be, how do I get from point B, which is the flip up position, to point C, which is ball release. Right, and so this would be the second part of the arm spiral. Here's Blake Snell, again, really showing these two different phases of the arm spiral. I love him as an example, just because he's got such a fluid, easy, smooth arm action. He throws upper 90s, and he really connects it well to the rest of his delivery. So what exactly is going on here? What exactly is happening with the second part of the arm spiral? What should happen? Well, first off, to get through the first part of the arm spiral, the arm pendulums freely and easily from handbrake into this high cock position. This is what the very most efficient throwers in the world do. Your Blake Snells, Jacob deGroms, Nolan Ryans, right? This is what the vast majority of high-level throwers do. And when I'm talking high level, I'm talking upper 90s, 100-mile-an-hour guys. There are pitchers who are successful who don't have extremely efficient arm paths, and that's okay. They make up for it by being extremely good pitchers as far as the skill of pitching. But most of the hardest throwers do seem to follow this kind of spiral staircase, or the spiral pattern analogy, and so Blake Snell just really illustrates this well. So he's loosely penduluming the arm in a relaxed fashion from handbrake all the way up into this retracted, flipped up position behind his body. From there, what does he do? From there, he's taking this energy that's wound its way through the pelvis, through the torso, and ultimately he's able to transfer that out and around into the arm. So as the torso rotates, what's happening is that the arm's already in this flipped up, retracted position. The torso starts to rotate, the arm lags behind a hair, and what you'll see is that there's actually a magnified stretch that happens through the chest. So if we take him to landing, and we look at the position Blake Snell gets into at landing, he's in this scap-loaded position where he's in this crazy amount of retraction and what's called horizontal abduction. So his scaps are pinched together and his shoulders are way back behind his body. And so what happens here is he's already in somewhat of a stretch through his chest, but as he begins to turn with his torso, that stretch is magnified. So there's a slight magnification of that stretch through his chest, and now the arm is pulled through. It creates this stretch reflex through the pec right here. Now the arm gets pulled through, and so you see when you actually take him to bar release, now the elbow isn't lagging way back behind the shoulders. The elbow catches up, and now it's in line with the shoulders at release. So there's this pulling action that happens from max retraction, the stretch is magnified, and then there's the slingshot effect. What happens when this gets screwed up is that the elbow will lead the way. It'll lead out in front of where the shoulders are, as opposed to lagging behind, pulling and catching up. It begins to push forward, tense up, and lead the way out in front of where the shoulders are. So ideally what we want is that the arm unwinds from the center out. This is called from proximal to distal, from the center of the body and from the ground up. So from the ground, through the pelvis, through the torso, magnify that stretch through the chest, and then the energy spirals from the inside out into the arm. So if you're able to get the arm up and on time in this flipped up retracted position, then what happens is the centrifugal force from the torso beginning to rotate will actually spiral that elbow out and around into elbow extension. And so that's where you get this second part of the arm spiral. As Blake Snell begins to rotate, the hand, the ball, the arm, it's being pulled out into elbow extension as a result of the torso rotation. Not actively from the tricep reaching out and extending, but from the inside out as the torso rotates, that force pulls the elbow out into extension. Now this effect is maximized if everything gets into the plane of rotation. So if you're not quite clear on exactly what I'm talking about, this is a great graphic from Paul Nyman from Set Pro from the early 2000s, where he kind of was able to describe and show exactly what that plane of rotation looks like. And essentially it's a line, it's the plane drawn through the shoulders. And so that plane is going to change depending on the posture that you have with your torso. So higher slack guy, that plane is going to be here as they rotate. A lower slack guy, that plane is going to be here. But the idea is that if you can get the arm, the ball, the elbow in that plane, wherever it might be, you're going to maximize your ability to create this effect and transfer the energy, again, from the inside out into the ball. And from there, it's important to understand, for an arm to move like this, you also need to consider the deceleration sequence. So in the deceleration phase, it actually happens distal to proximal. And so what you'll see is that now the unwinding happens from the hand into pronation, then into the shoulder in internal rotation, then from the scapula, then from the thoracic spine. And so for this sequence and this pattern to work properly, which we'll talk about in a second, there's a lot of different things structurally that need to be working in unison and need to have adequate mobility and stability for this to happen organically. And again, this is how an arm is supposed to move. I'm not describing something completely unique that you'll have to go and study and completely ditch everything that you're doing. Most players do this because this is how an arm is supposed to move. It's when something is broken in the kinetic chain, the arm is way off time, there's an injury compensation, there's some major tensional imbalance in the upper body, that this pattern gets kind of ruined. So just realize this is how an arm is supposed to move. A lot of little leaguers will do this naturally without you ever having to tell them what plane of rotation is. So just understand, we're kind of making it a little bit more complex to understand it, but at its root, this is really a simple, natural pattern that should happen. But as coaches, we need to be able to understand it, dive deeper into the problem when there is an issue with the sequence. So let's just briefly revisit the kinematic sequence to, again, just kind of reinforce this idea of elbow extension happening from that high cock position before internal rotation. Because a lot of coaches might initially think that it's more of a pushing path or a catapulting action into ball release, and they don't necessarily agree with this spiraling action of how the arm is supposed to move. What we've understood from kinematic sequence data, which essentially measures how that energy is transferred through the body by measuring things like pelvic rotational velocity, how fast the pelvis rotates, torso rotational velocity, how fast that rotates, elbow extension velocity, how fast that arm is unwinding into elbow extension, shoulder internal rotation velocity. We can measure all these things, and what data has shown from looking at a ton of different successful high-level throwers and lower velocity throwers, again, across tons of different studies, the common trend, and again, not just pitchers, but even in the golf world and other sports, there is a consistent kinematic sequence that emerges amongst the best players. So with pitchers, what again you'll see is that this order of events is very consistent. Pelvis peaks before the torso, which peaks before elbow extension, which peaks before shoulder internal rotation. And again, this is important because what happens if the elbow extension and the internal rotation happen together, now you have a pushing path. You want them to happen in order. You want elbow extension to happen first. That's the nice spiraling action from Jacob deGrom. Then shoulder internal rotation happens. So it should be in this fluid sequence from the inside out. And that's what graphs like these are describing. The pelvis peaks before the torso, peaks before the elbow extension velocity, peaks before the shoulder internal rotation velocity. So when you see graphs like this, that's really all it's describing, is that energy being transferred effectively through this tornado-like path inside out and transferring out through the arm in order. And again, just a great visual of exactly what's happening with Jacob deGrom. None of us would argue that he doesn't have an extremely efficient arm path. So let's talk a little bit about what needs to happen from a physical standpoint for this to occur. It should be a natural path, a natural pattern that just happens, but it doesn't always happen. So what are the pieces, the dominoes that have to fall into place for the arm to just naturally do its thing? Well, first you need the ability to get into clean layback and to get full elbow extension. So let's break that down. What are the components of clean layback? Well, the first is that your thoracic spine has to be mobile. You have to have the thoracic extension and rotation to your arm side in order to get that arm to cleanly lay back. So does your thoracic spine have the ability to move, or are you just locked up like a rigid board and you can't get that lay back because your thoracic spine doesn't move? So that's number one, thoracic extension rotation, extremely important. Number two, does your scapula have the ability to tilt and move as well? So if your thoracic spine can move, but your scapula is just stuck and you don't have the ability to tilt from your scapula, then again, you can't clear the way for that layback to occur. And then true shoulder external rotation. If your scapula and your thoracic spine can extend and clear the way for that layback to occur, you also need actual external rotation at the shoulder joint, ball and socket rotation. So if you can do all those things, you're gonna get good layback. From there, you need full elbow extension. This is something you commonly see with guys coming back from Tommy John surgery. They never regain full elbow extension, and so when they go to throw, they get here, they run out of room, and they cut off their throw early, or they get out in front of the plane of rotation and they start cutting everything. For that natural deceleration arc to occur, you need pronation and internal rotation. Again, super common when guys don't have internal rotation, they just completely lose out on their throwing side. They don't have the ability to actually finish that pitch. They'll slam into a rough deceleration path. And again, sometimes the arm will not give them the range and the arm speed that they want during the acceleration phase because it knows that it doesn't have this healthy deceleration pattern. Now let's say you have the ability to do all these things, but you're just not able to actually put it all together on the mound. Like what if Jacob deGrom, nothing changed physically about him, but suddenly he was 50% more tense when he went to throw? Well, his arm wouldn't move like it does right now. So you also want the ability to relax the different involved muscles. The most important ones that we see are the ability to relax the pec, lat, the bicep, the upper trap, and the forearm. So as you're going through that first phase of the arm spiral, if the pec takes over, you're not going to allow it to get into that flipped up protracted position. If the lat takes over, a lot of times as guys go to accelerate, the elbow will drop down and dive down as the lat takes over and tenses up, and they aren't able to keep the elbow relaxed and in plane with the shoulder. If the bicep takes over, as they go and the arm begins to unwind, the bicep will contract, take over, and cut off their actual elbow extension. If the trap takes over, as they go to go through the phase of their arm spiral, the upper trap will kick in, and oftentimes it'll create an arm timing issue. If the forearm tenses up, they're gripping the ball way too tight, this actually creates what's called an irradiation effect, where if you're gripping the ball too tight, it causes everything further up the chain, your neck, your trap, your pec, your lat. If you grip the ball too tight, everything up here also tenses as well. So the ability just to relax is somewhat of a trained skill, but also if you have a ton of tissue issues, a ton of mobility issues through any of these muscle groups, that can massively impact your ability to relax your arm, no matter how hard you try. So now let's talk a little bit about coaching considerations. How do we address this pattern when we see that it's screwed up? Well, first we need to identify that it's screwed up. So typically what you will see is that guys have a little bit of this tense pushing arm action. Maybe the elbow climbs. Maybe they've been doing a ton of heavy wrist weight throws, or 4-pound throws with a ball, or maybe they're coming back from an injury and their arm is beginning to kind of protect itself a little bit, or maybe they've been throwing through an injury. There are a ton of considerations, but you'll usually see this tense dart throwing type pattern where the arm just doesn't want to accept that natural pattern that it would normally go through. So the first way that we'll typically address it is with something called the lasso drill. This drill was coined, the lasso drill, by Baseball Development Group. I think it's a great fundamental drill to apply to pitchers who have any sort of problem between landing and how their arm accelerates into release. We'll talk a little bit about what, maybe the name lasso isn't what I would have chosen, but we do use this drill quite a bit, and we have our own kind of ways of coaching it. So go ahead and click the link in the video description if you want to check out how we exactly coach that drill. But again, this is a way to isolate what happens from landing into ball release and make sure that we get that phase right, especially for the guys that are pushy. The second tool that we'll commonly use is an Indian club. Now you can do holds or throws with this. You can do this with a lasso drill or any other variety of drills. But the basic point is that, again, we know that there's this centrifugal force as the torso begins to rotate that pulls the elbow into extension in a natural way, and then shoulder internal rotation happens. For guys that really can't feel that pattern, the Indian club, and we typically use about a 1-pound Indian club, so nothing crazy, but the Indian club basically just keeps that weight even further away from the axis of rotation, and so it maximizes that feeling of pulling the elbow out into extension. Again, we're not actively reaching and trying to throw the elbow into extension, but it's driven from the inside out, driven from the torso, and this can really, really exaggerate that feeling for guys who are just having trouble with that pattern for whatever reason. Again, even with a hold or a throw, the Indian club can make that make that transition easier. So what does this pattern feel like? How do we coach it? How do we cue it? Here's a couple tips. So what I feel and what I often kind of coach and cue with athletes is that as I'm throwing, there's really minimal tension. I'm trying to let my arm float and just relax. So I'm not even thinking about my arm. I'm just trying to let it float into position and then accelerate late. Float, accelerate late. Float, wait till the torso begins to fire. I'm trying to just feel this pull into bar release from my pec. And so float the arm, float and strike, capture the pendulum, and then pull into release. These are all different ways of thinking about the pattern. But again, what happens, we talked about as the torso begins to rotate, there's a slight lag, and then the arm is pulled into acceleration as the pec stretches. It's worth noting you're not going to feel this huge pec stretch as if you just did a pec wall stretch and yanked on it at max effort. It's not necessarily that. Just like if you did a vertical jump, you're going to get a stretch through your quads, hamstrings, and glutes, but it's not going to feel the same as if you did a full 10 out of 10 intensity quad stretch. So guys will sometimes hear like, hey, pec stretch, and they'll try to replicate a full pec stretch, against a wall and then think it's supposed to be the same feeling. It's not as much the feeling of this like tearing action as just feeling like you have something to pull against. So if you lag the arm behind and you relax it properly, you're going to feel like you have something to pull with, because again, going back to the Blake Snell example, that arm is in such deep retraction that it needs to catch up to the plane of the shoulders. It's that catching up feeling from here to here. That's the feeling of contracting the pec, feeling like you have something to pull with. If the arm gets out in front here, there's nothing to pull with, you're not going to feel that same feeling, and it's going to be much more of a tricep driven feeling as you go into bar release. And these are typically going to be guys that are having shoulder elbow issues or are kind of getting tricep soreness or tricep pain as well. Again, this should happen organically or naturally if the arm is in plane, relaxed, and there are no physical limits. The arm should move like an arm if you take away all the constraints. You get the arm naturally in plane and you can relax it as the torso rotates. Again, regardless of the plane, guys who are a little bit more upright, rotating here, there's still going to be that centrifugal force spiraling the arm out into extension. So here's what not to do. Here's some things I don't really like that I haven't seen work a ton. It doesn't mean they're not good cues, can't work, but again, this is typically less than helpful from my experience. The first is a hand-driven or forced elbow extension approach of addressing this pattern. And what I mean by that is we've talked about this pattern happening from the inside out. The torso drives that elbow extension. What some coaches will do is they'll teach the athlete to drive that elbow extension directly from the hand itself. And so that would look something like this. They'll do a lasso drill and they'll throw the arm out to the side. And it's an all arm motion driven from the hand, driven from distal to proximal, or the outside in. And it becomes just a pure hand driven movement versus the torso driving the movement and the arm as a reaction spiraling out and around. So some coaches will get that backwards, and you're just training athletes at that point to not generate that power from the center of their body and to generate it just from the arm itself, just by trying to chase that elbow extension variable, as opposed to realizing it's really a result of all these other things adding up. Some analogies I'm just not a huge fan of. One is this catapult analogy that I already mentioned. Some coaches think that as the arm gets into layback, it's just going from external rotation to internal rotation along this 180-degree catapulting action. Again, anyone that looks at slow motion video can see that's not what's happening. I don't really like that particular cue for it. In my experience, that can lead to some shoulder impingement issues when athletes just try to go through that type of pattern. They miss out on this smooth, unwinding, unfurling path that, in my opinion, is one of the more healthy ways to throw, because it is able to gradually accelerate and then dissipate that force through the chain. And then again, while we use the lasso drill, it's not necessarily the name I would have chosen for it, because again, if you think about the idea of throwing a lasso, it's kind of that hand-driven motion straight from the arm. It's not a motion that's driven from the pelvis and from the torso. It's really just a hand-driven motion. So if an athlete is specifically hearing that and thinking, I'm gonna throw like a guy throwing a lasso, I don't think that's that helpful. And just to go along with that, skipping rocks, I've heard that as like kind of an analogy or even a drill that some coaches might use. And again, it's the same problem. It's happening from the outside in versus the inside out. It becomes a hand-driven motion versus actually unwinding the arm from the torso. Not to mention, if you're going and skipping rocks and you're not a submarine or a sidearm guy, that's a good way to just screw up what's happening as far as your posture, your torso rotation, where your elbow is and your arm is in relation to that. Again, just not a fan of some of these analogies as far as properly cueing what should happen and what should go on. So hopefully you guys learned something, took something away from this video. I hope it was helpful. If you guys found this helpful, give this video a thumbs up, like the video, and share it with your friends. If you're not subscribed to this channel already, go ahead and hit the subscribe button and the notification bell, and drop a comment down below. We read and respond to every single one. If you guys are interested in online coaching, that's what we do here at Tread Athletics. We read and respond to every single email, so let us know what you're struggling with, and we'll get back to you as well. See you guys in the next video.